And in the next couple of slides, I wanted to just give you an idea of what one can do with such a framework. For example, here are some of the user objectives that we studied in a paper a few years back. And so we said, okay, let's look at, if I'm looking at a hybrid cyber infrastructure, what would be interesting user objectives? And one could be acceleration. Can I use clouds as accelerators to somehow improve the execution time of my application? And what we used there was, at that point, queuing times would become on popular resources on things like TeraGrid were significant. And so we were saying that if I have an application workflow and if there were certain tasks that could be offloaded to clouds, then can I offload them while I'm in the queue and try to spend a few dollars to get as much work done as possible, right? And so especially if you had large ensemble runs, you could start priming things, or you could start doing some sort of data preparation. You could do some initial explorations while you're waiting in the queue, and using cloud resources. And so we had some interesting experiments of the benefits of doing something like that and what are the associated costs. Another thing we said was, which is not very unrelated to the first objective, was one of conservation. Clearly there are some parts of your application workflow that have to run on this end resource that you have, maybe because of the configuration or capabilities that resource provides. But there are other parts of your application that may not need this kind of capability. As I said, data preparation, some exploration of parameters, or some simple analytics that don't have to run on this high-end resource, right? So and since I have limited allocations, can I use clouds to run these tasks that don't need the high-end resource, and then conserve the overall resources that I use on the HPC system, right? And then again, I have constraints in terms of how much I'm willing to spend for cloud resources, or what percentage I want my conservation or resource that I want to conserve. And we can play with different trade-offs between benefits, costs, and execution time of the application. And there was the paper included some detailed analysis in this space. And the final one was resilience, and the idea here was that there's an unexpected downtime on the system, or something goes wrong, and rather than having my week-long job terminate, can I offload it to the cloud while the system comes up, or partially offload it to the cloud? And so we played with some scenarios in terms of the cost and benefits of doing something like that, and even the feasibility of doing something like that for different applications. And can I use the cloud as a way to improve the overall resilience of my application, given that infrastructures sometimes tend to go down? And the different constraints that we looked at were constraints in terms of deadlines, constraints in terms of completion time of the application. For example, to select the resources that were most appropriate for that type of application based on certain application deadlines. For example, I need this data done because I need to use it to make some decisions or to configure some experiment, and so there might be some stricter deadline on the execution of certain parts of it. Budget, when you talk about public cloud, budget becomes important, and so you might want to constrain how much you want to spend, and how do you want to trade off time for cost. And so we included mechanisms to be able to do that, and then we've also done some studies as to how these trade-offs for different workloads come about. And then finally, we also looked at how to trade off different classes of resources and to be able to keep higher level constraints such as cost, budget, and deadline, but then be able to trade off resources from an economic point of view so that we are able to meet these higher level constraints, but then make things as cost effective as possible. And there are other such constraints you have looked at. These are just a few sampling that I've put in here.